Since the Soviet Union was the engine of European communism, and really communism around the world, because that's where communism started, it's an important case for understanding all the sorts of problems that emerge in the communist system. So I want to go through each one of the leaders of the Soviet Union to give you an idea of its evolution. So Lenin was the first one. Lenin led the communist revolution. He realized quite quickly that communism was not particularly workable under the conditions given to him. It was a peasant-based economy, as I mentioned before. It was an agrarian state. There was a tiny bourgeoisie, very little industrialization. He was embroiled in a civil war immediately. Those who were loyal to the Tsar, which was the former Tsar as like king, and then those who supported the revolution. You had international enemies fighting within the country. At least initially, they were very angry that Lenin wanted to pull out of World War I. So you had Brits, you had Americans, I believe French were also fighting. Have to double check that. But you had various allies who were against the Germans and who were angry that the Soviets were pulling out, or the Russians at this point. And then, to top it all off, Marx had predicted these global revolutions, and Lenin came in and, hey, look, no global revolution. Well, this is disappointing. So really what Lenin had to do is drop elements of communism right from the start. Instead, he opted for what he called war communism, and then the new economic program, which brought back elements of capitalism. Now, there was lots of repression, coercion, but also some flexibility. Lenin started this whole trend of coercion. This is a period where, churches and other religious institutions were blown up. Believers were arrested and sent off to Siberia. Bourgeoisie were attacked and sent. Anyone affiliated with the old regime was sent off. The Tsar and his family were sent off to a place not too far from Moscow where they were hacked into little pieces. They found their bodies sometimes, I think, in the 1990s. So that was Lenin. Lenin dies, and he explicitly says Stalin shouldn't take over in a letter that Stalin, conveniently, I think he destroyed. Whatever, no one else read the letter, apparently. And Stalin begins to fight for supremacy, and he fairly quickly wins out after Lenin's death. He had enemies inside the state and out, and lots of these enemies were in his head. He was very paranoid. He was very power-hungry. The picture you see here on the left is a picture of the Gulag. The picture you see on the right is, well, I'll get to that. He set the Soviet Union on a series of 5-year programs of rapid industrialization. Remember, this is an agricultural backwater. He needs to industrialize this place. And so he quickly transforms the country from this rural wasteland to a highly industrialized state through these 5-year programs. But he also set the trajectory. In terms of economic development, the Soviet Union was focused almost entirely on heavy industry. We're talking about metals, armaments, construction, infrastructure. They really lacked significant production of consumer goods, everything from cars to toilet paper. In terms of politics, he set the tone. It was all very top-down, very rigid. There weren't any attempts to reach consensus. You are with us or against us, was Stalin's phrase. He chased away known political rivals, and he went after lots of others who were potential political rivals. So the picture that you see here on the right is actually my great uncle off protecting Trotsky in Mexico City. Now, apparently, when Trotsky was hacked to death with an ice pick or ice axe, my great uncle, the man you see there, was off buying food. He was off duty, so I just want that for the record. But the way that Stalin actually consolidated power was to use political terror to deter potential rivals and to get rid of real rivals. And so you had the growth of the gulags. The gulags is this prison network. And there were some important side effects. He had purges that went all the way up to the top of institutions, which often left the state lacking capacity in certain sectors. The state was thoroughly unprepared for war. Stalin had purged the top military officers in the late 1930s. So by the time Hitler attacked in 1941, Stalin was not only shocked because he had signed an agreement and they agreed not to attack one another, but he was at a loss because his military brass had been purged by himself. Stalin dies in 1953, and a guy named Khrushchev eventually attains power. And at the 20th Party Congress in 1956, he stands up and he attacks Stalin. Khrushchev was a guy who tried a bunch of reforms, administrative as well as economic, but it wasn't about changing the nature of the system, just expanding the state and cracking down on excesses, corruption, other abuses. And so he leads the process of de-Stalinization. He's the first one to stand up there, and this was supposed to be a private secret meeting, but it got quickly out. He stands up and he says, hey, Stalin wasn't the great father that we all thought. He engaged in certain excesses, which I guess is how you talk about the murder of really millions of people indirectly, hundreds of thousands directly. Khrushchev, what else do you need to know about Khrushchev? Khrushchev initiated this political thaw, which, again, this is the 20th Party Congress generation. These are people like Gorbachev saw this, Yeltsin saw this, people who would become prominent in Russian politics later. He was also thrown out for stepping on too many toes. When you try to reform things, well, you're going to step on people's toes and they're not going to like that. And this is a picture of the 20th Party Congress, by the way. So it's very important. Just keep in mind this 20th Party Congress because it has really important implications for the development of the Soviet Union, the end of the Soviet Union, and the development of Russia. So Khrushchev was actually one of the few, probably the only except for Gorbachev, who was pushed out of power and didn't just die in power. And Brezhnev, Leonid Brezhnev, takes over. And he really presides over a neo-patrimonial system where the general well-being of the population comes in exchange for loyalty, or at least acquiescence. So you have huge state subsidies going from the center, i.e. Moscow, to the periphery, i.e. everywhere else, including the various republics of the Soviet Union, and also going from the elites to the masses, bread and butter sorts of issues. But these are high cost, right? You can't afford to just subsidize when you're not earning very much money. So it's difficult to continue to produce these subsidies. You had falling rates of growth under Brezhnev from about 7.8% in the mid-1960s to just around 3.5% by the early 1980s. And you had a net fall in agricultural output. This is a period under Brezhnev where the state is stagnant. Brezhnev means stagnant. There was no discipline. There was excessive alcohol consumption, which doubled between 1960 and 1980. In one 1982 survey, they found about a 30% absenteeism rate from work. People just didn't show up to their jobs. In one Moscow survey from around the same time, they estimated that about 10% of workers were actually present around closing time, which isn't a big surprise if you have to stand in line for 3 hours, get the kids and cook dinner all after work. Well, because you need to stand in line for 3 hours to get your portion of meat or bread or whatever it is. So not a big surprise, but the system was clearly dying. Local party leaders were given increased autonomy in return for obedience to Brezhnev. This led to embezzlement, falsified production quotas, which I mentioned before, bribes going every direction. So this period was remembered also as a time of laziness, a lack of innovation. Again, Brezhnev equals stagnation. And this was also a period of this increasing technology gap with the West. Missiles and then especially Star Wars launched under Reagan. This is also a period of growing corruption and the black market. There's lots of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours through the administration from Moscow down to the republics. But the system is clearly struggling. Brezhnev is also the butt of lots of jokes. If you look up online Brezhnev jokes, you'll find a lot. I'll just tell you one really quick one because I love this one. At the 1980 Olympics, Brezhnev starts his speech and he goes, "Oh," and people clap. "Oh," people clap more. "Oh," he's getting really excited because people are clapping more and more. "Oh," and they've got a standing ovation. "Oh," and the whole audience is just freaking out. And then the aide comes running up to the podium and whispers, "Mr. Brezhnev, that's the Olympic rings. You don't need to read the Olympic rings." So he was seen as this sort of dumb guy who somehow got into power. By the end of Brezhnev's reign, the legitimacy of the system and the elites was really threatened. You no longer had terror to keep people in line, and promises really bred some of the demands. And you had excessive demands that just really went way over what the state could deliver. Official promises usually generated these demands. Right? The ideology, communism, we're moving forward. Everything you saw in the press, rosy pictures, but your lives weren't so rosy, and so you had these demands, and the system couldn't meet them. So there was a general consensus that reforms are necessary. And so Andropov was the first of two interim leaders after the death of Brezhnev in the early 1980s. And when I say interim, I mean interim because he was old, he was half dead. And this was really a result of indecision. There was a lack of consensus about how to reform. We need to do something, but there was a lot of caution at the top. And so Andropov comes in and he launches a major reform program attacking corruption, alcohol consumption. He removes some of the older, more corrupt officials, and then he dies. And then Chernenko briefly takes control, another interim leader, again, old, half dead, and he tries to really reverse everything that Andropov did. And then he dies. Again, he was old and sick. He had little impact on the system. So after a few years, after these couple leaders, there's really a rising consensus by now that things have to change. And Gorbachev, who had been a go-between for Andropov and the Politburo, which again, the Politburo is like the cabinet, during Andropov's period, fights off Brezhnev's disciples, and he struggles to take power and get some young reformers' blood in power. So this is the rise of Gorbachev. And so by 1985, Gorbachev is in power. He came off as overzealous to many in the population. There wasn't this flood of people who went out and said, "Yay, Gorbachev has taken power." One of the first things he does is he leads an anti-alcohol campaign, which back when I was studying in Russia in 1994, a couple years after Gorbachev lost power and the Soviet Union ceased to exist, people told me this is what they remember most about Gorbachev's rule. This is certainly evidence for the contention that perestroika wasn't just about popular pressures for change. You don't do that through anti-alcoholism when alcohol is the key source of entertainment in the country. What Gorbachev did is he planned broad economic reforms, perestroika, this rebuilding. But this didn't take place till a few years after he took power. He focused on decentralization of the economy, lowering the size of the administration, providing better access to information, and this was glasnost. This is from the Russian word golos, which means voice. So this is this opening, increased economic incentives. So, for example, you no longer had production quotas that were governed by Moscow. So all these things were Gorbachev's doing. Now, if you have things like this, you're going to find resistance. And so entrenched interests fought back. They argued that we didn't need economic reform here, just more discipline. They weren't so much conservatives as reactionaries. Remember what reactionaries refer to, going back to this earlier idealized time. They attacked glasnost, which threatened many elites dependent on the status quo. They called it a cause of ethnic strife and almost anarchy, which in some cases was true. You had ethnic-based grievances that were opening up during this period of glasnost as well. They actually these reactionaries attacked Gorbachev in the state-controlled press. It was the first big division since Khrushchev, and it was much bigger. Now, these tensions meant that Gorbachev had to move more aggressively. He didn't necessarily want to move more aggressively towards democracy. He liked communism. He wanted to keep communism. He wanted to make communism work. But he was forced to move because of these reactionaries. As he came up against obstacles to this program of uskorienia, or acceleration, he became more and more radical. He felt that society, forced by the economic deadweight of the system, was ready for broader change, and he pressed for broader perestroika. And there were four key objectives to Gorbachev's agenda. One, to modernize, bring technological infrastructure in. Remember, people saw Western standards at this point. People had satellite TVs. Maybe it was illegal, but they would put their satellites up. They would in the dark, and they would get Western programs. They saw things that they didn't have. You also, of course, had Star Wars going on at this point. This new campaign for space in the arms race. So the second element was to decentralize the management structure, to reorganize the means of production. The third was to crack down on waste and inefficiency, which defined the system. Again, that was a key role of Glasnost. A key role of Glasnost was to allow people to vent their grievances and to say, hey, my factory manager is stealing something, so that they could crack down on that factory manager, which again, in the name of cracking down on waste and inefficiency. And the fourth point was democratization. Glasnost, again, it increased greater accountability among lower level leaders, exposed corruption and inefficiency, and it eventually also became important to gaining popular support. Gorbachev was up against a giant. There were lots of people with vested interests, and he needed to find allies. And he eventually found allies in the population. Again, he wasn't a populist. He didn't move in that direction for years and years until he was really pushed by the reactionaries to move much further than he would have liked to. Now, as Gorbachev led up, you had more democracy and less coercion, and nationalism surfaced and propelled major anti-system movements around the USSR and also Eastern Europe. Okay, so before the Soviet Union collapsed, communism had collapsed in Eastern Europe. In the late 1980s, Gorbachev made clear that he would no longer intervene to maintain Communist Party dominance in Eastern Europe, as the Soviets had in 1956, 1968, arguably 1981. So you had major protests around the communist world, which led to negotiated transitions and a few forced transitions, really within months of each other, beginning with Poland and ending in Romania and East Germany. And you also had increased animosity at home by the hardliners, these reactionaries. And so here's a picture where they staged a coup in August of 1991. They put Gorbachev in his summer home, his dacha, and said that he was unhealthy. They always say someone's unhealthy. But Russians took to the streets under the leadership of Yeltsin, who we'll talk about when we talk about Russia. The coup failed. Gorbachev's political career, though, was effectively over. And 4 months later, the Soviet Union simply disappeared. So I'll stop this, and we'll go into another set of slides, and we'll talk about post-communism.